Hey everybody! Today we're going to be expanding upon a previous video that I did about using enclosures and approaches in our improvisation. That video covers the basics of this concept, so if you're starting from ground zero, I would highly recommend watching that video first, and then once you get those concepts down, then come back to this video and you can expand upon them. But for this video, like I said, we're gonna expand upon the ideas of enclosures and approaches in improvisation, and also talked about how they can be used in jazz language. Okay, let's jump right into it. The first way that we can expand upon enclosures and approaches is something called a pivot tone. All this means is that we pedal one tone or note and then chromatically approach another tone or note. For example, a common way to use a pivot tone on a minor chord would be this. So in this case, we are using the fifth as our pivot tone and approaching the sixth chromatically. If you put this over a 2-5 chord progression, then that sixth becomes the third of our dominant chord and sounds like this. And then if we resolve to the one chord of that 2-5-1 using just scales and enclosures like we did in my previous video, then you would have a line that sounds something like this. Here are some other examples of 2-5 lines using pivot tones. You can also use pivot tones on major and dominant chords. For these types of chords, usually the root is the pivot tone. For example, here's a great blues line using this concept. So that example uses the root as the pivot tone and approaches the fifth from the third of the chord. You can also do the opposite. Start from the fifth of the chord and then walk down to the third. Again, this concept works over both major and dominant chords. So if you were using this in a blues, it might sound something like this. Or if you were playing this over a major 2-5-1, it would probably sound something like this. They both work really great and are really quintessential in having the sound of jazz language in your playing. So our next concept that expands upon enclosures and approaches is simply using approaches in arpeggios. Yep, it's that easy. For example, this concept is used a lot in bebop playing. A common way that people incorporate this is over dominant chords. Here's an example. Super simple. All that's happening is that we are approaching each tone of a G major arpeggio by a half step, and then resolving to the third of our one chord, again, by approaching of a half step. Let's look at this concept in the context of some actual jazz lines. The first one is from Donald Byrd's solo on Lex and sounds like this. Super simple ideas, but it really sounds great. All he's doing is walking up the dominant 9 arpeggio, then doing a 5-note enclosure to the 7th of our dominant chord, and then using our half-step approach on the arpeggio of the dominant chord. Here's one more line from Wes Montgomery's solo on D natural blues. This almost uses the same idea that Donald used on his solo, but now we're altering the dominant chord by adding the sharp 5 and sharp 9 to it. The first part of this lick is based on a classic West shape that he would use often over minor 9 chords, and then he just adds an enclosure of the third to it. Then we get to the altered chord. He's pretty much playing off an E flat major triad, which gives us that altered sound, but then using our half step approach to approach each note of that triad. Our last way that we can expand upon approaches and enclosures is using chord shapes. Oftentimes when people are comping, they always try to throw in as many crazy chord shapes as they can. Now, using a lot of these cool shapes isn't bad, but we can get a lot of mileage just out of our basic standard fundamental guitar voicings. So for example, here's a 2-5-1 with basic guitar voicings. Now treat these shapes like single note lines and add approaches and enclosures to it, and you get something that sounds like this. Not too bad, right? It gets better if you throw in some other chord voicings into the mix. Here I just added a minor 9 shape, as well as a major 6 and major 6-9 shape. Try throwing in inversions of the chords too. Let's take that half step approach from Donald Byrd's solo and apply it to our comping. Of course, you need to know the inversions of each chord shape, but you get the idea. When you start comping and thinking about your chord shapes as single note lines that you can approach or enclose, then it can really open up your comping. Thanks so much for watching this video about expanding enclosures and approaches in our improvisation. If you like the videos and what I'm doing here, make sure to hit that subscribe and like button for more content in the future. Also, I'm open for private lessons. Make sure to message me through my email, which you can find in the link below, as I have some spots opening up for the coming school year. Also, let me know what topics you want me to cover next. Leave your comments below. And as always, thanks for watching, and remember to always keep swinging.